The community's love for the sport of basketball started in a humble gymnasium in the middle of Mcpherson, Kansas. In the early 1930s, a hometown basketball team would fill this building with 1,200 cheering fans. The Mcpherson Globe Refiners were able to follow their dream to the 1936 Olympics in Berlin.
You know, the world in the late 1920s, early 1930s was a difficult place. Not only here in the United States where we're going through the Great Depression, things have been happening in Europe as well. And that's really where we see the rise of Nazi Germany coming out of World War I and the economic depression of the 20s. There was this political movement that kind of developed out of nowhere. And by 1933, they had taken power in Germany. Hitler had been named chancellor. And it was his goal, of course we wouldn't find out until several years later, to have this master race.
In 1936, of course, the Nazis were in power in Germany. I find it interesting in looking at some of the stories that the players told when they went over there, that they knew there were issues, especially with the Jewish issue, but they didn't see a lot of it.
This was really going to kind of be a test, especially us against Germany. And so the team that we sent over there, I think, had 19 or 20 African Americans representing the United States. Of course, we all know about Jesse Owens and his 4 gold medals that he won at the Olympic Games, which really sent the message to Hitler and the rest of the world that, you know, there wasn't a master race. This was we were the free people of the United States, and we went over there and dominated his game. You know, James Naismith invented the game of basketball in 1891. The first game wasn't even played until later that year, or the next year in 1892. And by 1936, you know, it's the first year that it's going to be held in the Olympics. So within a 40-year period, this game goes from absolutely nothing to, you know, the world stage. And this was a big deal. Here in the state of Kansas, we had been playing basketball. James Naismith brought the game with him when he became coach at the University of Kansas in 1898. Was KU's first coach. Matter of fact, KU's only coach still today with a losing record, and it was his game. But, you know, we had been playing for 30-some years, and it had become a big sport here on the Plains. Several industry teams began to pop up, most notably the Globe Refiners, who would go on to form the nucleus of this 1936 basketball team. And so what happened in the lead up to the Olympics in 1936 is they knew basketball was coming, and they needed to determine who was going to be on the team. And so they held a tournament where all these club teams and college teams and industry teams competed to see who would form the...
In 1936, the Mcpherson Globe Refiners, who were sponsored by the Globe Refinery here in Mcpherson, won the National AAU, Amateur Athletic Union Basketball Championship. Gene Johnson, I think, had a pretty good idea that his team would make it and get to the Olympic trials, which would be held later in the year. That would be after the AAU championships in 1936. So I think he probably wanted to get his boys to get an idea of what it would be like to play on a big court in front of a huge crowd.
They were the first team west of the Mississippi to play in Madison Square Garden, and the New York press, and indeed the national press, just went wild when they saw the dunk for the first time.
They introduced publicly the dunk and did that in New York, not primarily in games, but in exhibitions, and that was, so I'm told, to intimidate the other side.
And this is where the New York Times sports writer coined the frame, dunking the ball, much as you would dunk a donut into your coffee. And hence, this type of shot was named the dunk from a New York sports writer watching the Mcpherson players warm up.
A lot of passing, and Gene taught his players to do a fast break, move all over the court. He called it helter-skelter basketball. One of his quotes was, defense wasn't in their game. They don't care how many points the other team scores because they always figure they'll score more points than they did. So I think he was a firebrand. I think he was a little bit cocky and very confident. But ahead of his time, I think, and he doesn't get enough credit.
On July 8, 1936, the Mcpherson Globe Refiners packed 6 tall basketball players, a coach, 2 wives, and a child into 2 cars and headed for New York City. They knew this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and they would return to Kansas as Olympians. But did the team have what it took to bring home a gold medal?
The whole Olympic team went over on the USS Manhattan. So you have the whole group of the Olympians going over there. So they got to mingle with all these people. The only trouble was they didn't have any practice facilities, and so they talked about how they would go out on the boat and try and, do some passing drills and dribbling drills and that sort of thing. But the wind sometimes would catch the ball and blow it off the boat, so they probably didn't get a whole lot of practice going over.
The team itself was known as the tallest team in the world. Up until that time, too, big men, at least from what I can understand, big men weren't as important in the game, especially as they are today. And again, it was more a game of skill, of passing, and so forth. And these guys sort of turn that around. And especially when you have Joe and Willard could win almost every tip-off. Back then, after you scored a point, after made a basket, the teams would come back to center court and they'd have another tip-off. And with these 2 players, they're basically winning every one. So there are some that say they also helped change that rule to instead of having to tip off it after every basket, then the other team would just take the basketball out of bounds. The team that had just been scored on would take the basketball out of bounds.
Hitler, through Goebbels, who was his propaganda chief, saw that it would be a great propaganda coup if they could win, that is, Germany would win the Olympics and prove that the Aryan race was superior. So we had between 1933 and 1936 a lot of Nazi takeover of the German culture, including the discrimination against Jews.
One thing he did talk about when he was over there was, he was 3 feet from Hitler, which he didn't know was that big of a deal until, years later. He said if he had known then what was going to happen, he would have jumped him right there.
I wish he had.
It always kind of gives me the heebie-jeebies just thinking about that.
There wasn't anything that they saw there that was really true because it was all being put on for show.
What did they have when they got to Berlin? What they found was quite shocking to them because they had to play with basically a very lightweight volleyball. And this volleyball wouldn't bounce right. It didn't have the texture, the dimples the good American basketballs had in the mid-1930s. But the biggest change they weren't used to was playing out of doors.
Only a person who had no knowledge and a great ego would envision a basketball court with a concrete edge standing up above the clay court, because that's just a situation of disaster. The clay courts, they knew it was not going to work, but Hitler was not going to change, and the Olympic Committee was not going to change because they didn't want to ruffle anybody's feathers. And playing on the dirt, sliding on the clay was just totally a nightmare.
And it seems quite contrary, it seems impossible today. But the first Olympic gold medal game, August 14, 1936, between the United States and Canada was contested in a rainstorm where perhaps 2 inches of rain fell on the proceedings. It took the effect of being a bath basin. So as the rain came down, there was no provision for draining.
Actually, it was such a muddy, slick condition that they played the first half on one court and they moved over to another court to play the second half. The court that we were supposed to play on originally was a sunken court, and it had 6 inches of water on it. So we had to play, actually it was played on the practice courts.
Impossible conditions, and that explains easily why the final score was US 19, Canada 8.
It was a triumphant moment when Bill Wheatley, a farm boy from Gibson, Kansas, received the first Olympic gold medal in basketball for the American team.
But it was absolutely fantastic. It makes me shudder every time I think about it. Playing that national anthem and you walk up on that top stand and hand you that gold medal.
At the time, basketball wasn't as big as it is today. Amateur Athletic Union basketball was sort of, I guess you might say, king at that time. The college game wasn't as big as it is today. The pros weren't around yet. There were some pro teams on the East Coast, like the Harlem Globetrotters and some of the other teams that did a lot of barnstorming. But as far as professional teams like the NBA, there weren't any of those. So it wasn't until years later that maybe this impact of what the Globe Refiners did really became apparent. And that, again, being that the first gold medal ever won in Olympic basketball history was won by these players in Kansas, or at least a good portion of them. Of the team was from these players from Kansas.
Like a bird on a tree, I'm just sitting here. I got time, it's clear to see. From up here, the world seems small.